The exposure of a picture is influenced by your camera aperture, shutter speed, ISO settings, and of course the available light. As you can see in these two images, the aperture you use can have a big impact on the mood and the feel of our images. The image shot at f16 has a lot more sharpness, but the background has become busy and distracting. We want a more dreamy look, like in the image shot at f2.8. Actually, we want to find the right balance between this dreamy look and the amount of sharpness. Let's have a look at another example. Here we have an image shot at f22. The background is busy, but we have a lot of sharpness. When we now have a look at the same composition shot at f2.8, we see that we have a nice soft background, but the image has a very narrow depth of field, and only a very small part of the flowers are in focus. So, to find a balance between the two, you could choose an image shot at f6.3. It combines a soft background with enough sharpness in the image. This all means that the aperture plays a very important role in our camera settings. So, in our flower photography, we need to be able to select our aperture without too much hassle. And in this, aperture priority mode gives us most freedom. In the aperture priority mode, you can change your aperture quickly without having to think too much about your shutter speed. Just let the camera do that part of the work. For that reason, I shoot my images in aperture priority. That is AV mode in Canon and A mode in Nikon. Aperture priority mode has some advantages. When shooting flower portraits, you're working outside, and the light conditions can change suddenly from shot to shot. Sometimes even between two shots without changing your composition. Shifting clouds can suddenly cast a shadow, and from subject to subject the light intensity can change a lot, especially in forested areas. For my flower photography, I don't choose a tripod, I'm shooting handheld. A big part of this photography is finding the perfect composition, and it can make a whole lot of difference when you move your camera just a bit up, down or sideways. You really need to be able to do these micro adjustments easily. On a tripod it can be quite complicated, and it will take far too much time to just get it right. So, we will be shooting handheld, and that means that our shutter speeds have to be fast enough to avoid camera shake. In aperture priority mode, you dial in the aperture you want, and the camera adjusts the shutter speed for optimal exposure, just like you can see here. I set the aperture and your camera sets the shutter speed. Now, I can fine-tune the exposure by dialing in an over or under exposure as needed. Here I change the under or over exposure, and you see that the camera adjusts the shutter speed accordingly. So I set my camera to aperture priority mode and let the camera select the shutter speed. But always be aware that your shutter speed isn't getting too slow. We're shooting handholds, so shutter speeds need to be fast enough to avoid camera shake. You can adjust your ISO settings when your shutter speed becomes too slow. Normally, the ISO should be set as low as possible, but I tend to set my ISO a little higher, so I have the room to close down my aperture without having to worry too much about my shutter speeds. Most of my images are shot in the range of an ISO between 200 and 400, but quite often I set my camera at ISO 800 or even 1600 when shooting flower portraits. Modern cameras can handle higher ISOs without becoming too noisy. We want to create artistic flower portraits, and these painterly dreamy images are created by using a shallow depth of field. So we shoot our flower portraits wide open or a little bit closed down, if we need some more detail. My apertures range from f2.8 to f16, but most of my images are shot in the range of f2.8 to f4.5. Picking the right aperture is not easy, especially in the beginning, and therefore I have created a special chapter on this topic. Subscribe to our newsletter and receive a series of free videos full of tips on macro photography. get promotion codes for our masterclasses, and much more.